We've done a number of projects on the cassava value chain in Nigeria, but also in Ghana and Mozambique. A few projects focus first on understanding the commercial value and the commercial potential of cassava, understanding that cassava is obviously a food crop. There are also a large number of commercial applications for cassava in the likes of starch and ethanol and many others as well, in pharmaceuticals and food and beverages and in alcohols and a whole range of other industries. So that was the first project, was looking at what's happening in the cassava value chain and where is the commercial potential, what's the size of the potential given that cassava is grown and eaten across the continent. So that was one. We also worked again with African Development Bank and IDH, looking at setting up an Africa cassava industrialization facility, looking again at Nigeria, Ghana and Mozambique to actually unlock that commercial potential, where you have a number of cassava processors, but they don't necessarily have access to the finance that they need to grow their businesses, as well as to source from smallholder farmers. Then over the last year, we've been working with the Rockefeller Foundation on the Cassava Innovation Challenge, which was aiming to identify solutions to address the post-harvest losses in cassava. And what that means is that when you grow cassava, after you take it out of the ground, you have between 24 to 72 hours before it spoils. And so we're looking for solutions to address that spoilage. So I'm not necessarily looking at any of the end-use innovations, but there are a whole range of them. So obviously there's the traditional food products that we're eating, like gari, that is probably the number one use, at least in Nigeria. But there's also quite a large focus of something called cassava beer, where you're actually substituting some of the other products in beer, whether it's sorghum, millet, or otherwise, with cassava instead. So they've tested that out, I believe, in one southern African country, either Mozambique or another country where SAB Miller actually has some cassava beers that they've released. And the beer companies are actually keen to try and do that in West Africa as well. It's a range of things. So one, we're the largest producer in part because we eat so much cassava. So it's really a large part of our caloric intake. And really you see the same thing across the continent as well, where people are producing quite a bit, but it's actually being consumed close to home. So oftentimes on the farm. So it's definitely a major product for Nigeria, and part of the reason is our large population size. So people are really consuming it in large quantities, but oftentimes really on the farm rather than looking at for export. That's the same really across the continent, where cassava is a large part of caloric intake, but it's not necessarily being exported outside of the borders. What you'll see in Nigeria, for example, is farmers will keep the cassava in the ground. Oftentimes the gestation period, or how long it takes to grow, is anywhere from, let's say, 9 to 12 months, and sometimes even longer. But you can actually keep the cassava underground for longer and still eat it. The reason people do that is almost like a storage facility for them, because people don't have access to cold storage because of the cost, because it's hard to get cold storage to different rural locations. And so what you'll see is that people store the cassava and use it for their own consumption. And then they will also harvest it for local processing and for other traders who are coming through. The challenge is the timing. Because of that 24 to 72 hour window for cassava to spoil, if you harvest your cassava and then a trader doesn't come for 2 days, you can essentially lose your crop. So that's one of the big challenges with export, is getting the cassava from a whole range of rural locations where it's being grown to a place where it can be processed efficiently, and then finally to the port for export. So that the chain is a bit broken between the farm and the processor. I'd say logistics, and then also, one of the big issues with cassava is its sort of genetics as well. So you will have spoken with IITA, so I won't go into all of that, but it's quite difficult to come up with new varieties of cassava that address, for example, the post-harvest waste and loss, but also still have the nutritive content or the ethanol content if you're looking at commercial applications. So in a way, you can't have all the qualities. So if you pick resistance to pests, for example, which is a big issue, you might lose out on shelf life. Or if you pick shelf life being quite important, you might lose out on the taste or on the ethanol content. So the variety research is definitely still ongoing. I think there have been massive strides since the 70s in terms of pest resistance and sort of looking at things like nutritive content. So you'll see vitamin A enriched cassava, these kinds of things, but there's almost always a trade-off, whether it's in terms of the size of the tuber, it's in terms of the taste or whatever it might be. So that's definitely one piece of it. I'd say the next piece of it is going to be around the planting and the harvesting sort of processes. For now, they have been quite manual, and that's not necessarily a challenge, but it does mean that cassava is quite labor intensive. So if you want to sort of harvest an entire row, how much time is it going to take to actually get it out of the ground? So there's some conversation about equipment and new tools that you can use to harvest with tools rather than with your hands. The issue, of course, is that if you harm the tuber in the harvest process, that can actually speed up the spoilage process. So it will go faster to spoil rather than the 24 to 72 hours. Then once you've harvested, of course, there's not storage, and then the logistics questions come into play there as well. So I don't think you can do one without the other, right? So there's a number of programs ongoing to get the right stems into the hands of farmers that are actually highly productive, meaning have the high yield and that sort of are resistant to the pests, etc. So I think that's part of it. I don't think that we've sort of fully saturated the market in terms of getting smallholder farmers access to these stems. So I think that needs to continue to be developed, and specifically like a commercial model that's more sustainable. So at some point, the government and donor funding for these programs will end. Can it actually continue without them? So I think that's one. And then I think two is going to be the logistics question. So whether it's about addressing the post-harvest loss and getting solutions that farmers can use that are low cost into their hands, but then also connecting them with traders or with processors who are a bit closer to the farm, who can actually get this product that's going to spoil within 1 to 3 days to a processor to process. It's a big issue. If you talk to the former Minister of Agriculture, who's now the President of the African Development Bank, it was definitely one of his big concerns, is that back in the day we used to actually export cassava. Now, we're quite struggling. So you see, we were speaking earlier, we're seeing even some imports into the country. So one of the issues is that we haven't established that commercial value chain. Is one, and then two, we have a large amount of cassava that's grown by smallholder farmers. I think it's something like 90% of the cassava is really done at the smallholder level, which does make it very hard in terms of the logistics to collect from all these different farms, get it to the processors if they even exist, and then think about export. Whereas in other countries, for example in Asia, you do have a much more established sort of cassava plantation, if you will, as well as processing technologies. So they're looking at exporting. I think there's one, we'll say positive in a way, is that China is actually quite interested in cassava for their commercial production, and so has been looking at a number of countries in terms of the potential to source cassava chips from the countries and actually import it to China. So I think there is huge potential still in terms of the export market, but we have to balance that always with the food requirement as well. So I think there's going to be some pressure in the coming years to figure out, if we develop too much on the commercial front, will we affect, for example, the price of cassava that people can actually buy it at? And what does that mean for food security? So I think the two have to be looked at in parallel as we look at developing the commercial and developing exports. In my view, if you're trying to really raise 4x, I'm not 100% convinced that you go for cassava, given all the challenges that we've discussed. I think there are quote-unquote easier crops, for example, that can be exported with limited processing in country that can still gain a pretty high value. For cassava, I think we're still not price competitive with international markets, so it's not necessarily going to be the first crop we focus on. I think we need to fix some of the logistics and processing issues first before we're going to be seeing massive exports of cassava. But that all depends on the financing. So we've seen this before with China. If they're able to bring in some very low interest government financing and set up a processing facility and a plantation at the same time, and get the outgrower sort of farming going, I think you could end up having quite an interesting export story there when you get the cost of production a bit lower. Well, I mean, the main thing is to look at what is the sort of international cost levels and can you meet them. So they need to really do a value chain analysis to say how much can they develop the crop at, so to produce the crop at the farm level or buy it from the market. How much is it going to cost per unit to actually process the crop if it's something that needs to be processed? And then how much is it going to take to transport and export the crop? Once you do that analysis, you can see if you're at the international levels and can be competitive or not, or if there's a domestic market or regional market that you can think about sort of tapping into. Yeah, so I think the Cassava Bread Initiative is similar to sort of the challenges we have with trade policy. Anything that's going to be government-led in terms of requirements is not necessarily sustainable. So I think that's really the number one issue. Similar to if we put an import ban on, let's say, dairy or on wheat or whatever it might be, or very high tariffs, we don't know that in 4 years or 5 years, the next administration, the next government, the next governor, the next whoever is going to reverse that or not. And that's one of the big challenges, is that issue of policy consistency. So is this policy going to continue for the next 20 years so we can actually, maintain or not? So I think that's one. And then the second one is that there's obviously some taste palette questions. So while there have been a number of innovations and a lot of work on sort of developing appropriate recipes for cassava bread and sort of cassava flour substitution, they haven't necessarily cracked it yet in terms of getting out to the consumer who's used to a certain type of bread, different taste palette. So I think the potential could have been there if you see a consistency in the requirement and the application. I think the other question is, do you want to put it as a benefit or as sort of a stick, so carrot or a stick? So for those bakeries and others who are using cassava flour, do you give them, for example, a tax cut, or do you fine them if they're not using it? So what's the easiest application? And then also, how do you actually monitor and make sure that it's happening? So is the bread actually being tested for its cassava content or not? And how do you actually apply this? So I think a lot of it has to do with more around the logistics of applying these trade policies or these sort of support policies for cassava. No, I'm not saying that. I think if we say that, we have to have a very different policy environment than we have in Nigeria. Right now, if you say one thing, in 5 to 10 years, you'll have a very different thing happening. So if you look at the tariffs across agricultural products over the last 10, 15 years, you see they go up and down. They're very much outside of the ECOWAS Common External Tariff regime, and Nigeria really sets its own policy. And that uncertainty is actually quite difficult for investment. So I think a law forcing cassava processors or bakers to use cassava flour is not necessarily going to be supportive in the long term. And I think what you have to do is think about how do you develop the market such that it makes sense to use cassava flour instead of wheat flour. And from a business perspective, let's say if it's less to use cassava flour, and it makes sense to substitute, let's say 10 or 20% of the wheat flour that you're using, and you have recipes that the customers actually like to eat, then I think cassava bakers and others, or rather bakers and others, will start to use cassava in their product without that government pressure. So it's more about fixing the unit cost of production in a way, getting it to a point where it makes sense to substitute cassava. And you can have some supports in a very near-term sense, but it has to be very clear when they're ending and how we're transitioning them out if we do want to put it into, let's say, a law. I haven't heard of specific news about a policy change, but I'm hearing that it's not working. So I imagine that it's not being enforced. It's a tough one. I think there's a huge potential, but as I said, you need the business case to make sense. You need the taste to make sense. And if you don't get those two things right, cassava bread policy won't work here. right? You've seen other African countries. I think it's either Zambia. I think it's Zambia has a similar sort of policy and a push, but there's also been senior level support from the president. There's been sort of marketing campaigns in a way with consumers. There's been requirements almost at the government level to procure bread that has cassava in it. So if you see snacks at a government meeting, they'll have cassava bread, these kinds of things. So I think you need some amount of pulling mechanisms, if you will, to get the industry started. And it's been tough in Nigeria to set those kinds of pulling mechanisms up that are short-term in nature. So I'm not saying we should support cassava for the next 20 years, but if you're going to do it, you probably need some time frame with some sort of policy support and then a very clear path for it to exit as well. I don't think we have the civic advocacy perhaps that you have in other countries to sort of petition for or protest for or go out in support of certain policies. So policy inconsistency is going to continue to be a challenge. I think that's one. And then two is, I think until we have leaders who are really keen on understanding that they don't have to change everything. They can sort of maybe affect some of the changes, but some of the policies of the past administrations were perhaps quite positive. We'll keep those and see how we can continue to support rather than start again from the bottom. So I think it's going to take a long time before we have that policy consistency. I think the other thing is where we have I would say inequality and significant amounts of power in the hands of large businesses, you're not necessarily going to see that policy consistency either. So where a large business can actually influence the policy of the national government, of the federal government, that's where we're going to see continued issues. So unless there's some sort of a buffer there, I don't think that's going to change.